As the day quietly fades and stars begin to whisper above, welcome to Korean History Whispers. Tonight, we gently explore the heart and mind of Choi Young, the legendary general whose iron will shape the destiny of medieval Korea. While his triumphs are carved into the chronicles, tonight you will hear the untold emotions behind them. Close your eyes and let his whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep. The year was 1316, and the world trembled on the edge of chaos. In the fading light of the Goryeo dynasty, when kingdoms rose and fell like autumn leaves, a child was born who would become both savior and destroyer. His name was Choi Young, and his story begins not with glory, but with loss. Imagine, if you will, the ancient city of Kyeongwon, where mountain mists clung to traditional rooftops, and the scent of pine filled the morning air. Here, in a modest household bearing the proud lineage of the Kyeongwon Choi clan, young Choi Young learned his first lesson about the fragility of life. His family once stood among the mighty, tracing their roots to Choi Young, a founding father of the Goryeo dynasty itself. His ancestor Choi Young had once walked the halls of power as a high minister during King Gaegyeong's reign. But greatness, like morning frost, can vanish with the rising sun. By the time Choi Young drew his first breath, the family's golden age had dimmed to a flicker. His father, Choi Young, served modestly as a judicial inspector, a position of respect but not of wealth or influence. The boy would learn early that noble blood meant nothing without the strength to defend it. The cruel teacher arrived when Choi Young reached his 16th year. Death, that universal equalizer, claimed his father with swift and merciless precision. In a single moment, the teenager found himself alone in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. No loving guidance would shield him now. No family connections would smooth his path. Everything he would become, every victory he would claim, every enemy he would face, all of it would flow from his own iron determination. Years passed like pages turning in a book written in blood and sweat. While other young men of noble birth found easy positions through family influence, Choi Young walked a harder road. He understood that in this turbulent age, only one thing mattered: the strength to survive and the courage to fight. The coasts of Goryeo had become hunting grounds for Japanese raiders, savage wolves who descended from the sea to burn villages and carry away the innocent. Here, in these desperate battles against maritime predators, the young man began to forge his reputation. Picture him in those early days, not yet the legendary commander who would shake empires, but a determined youth with fire in his eyes and steel in his heart. Each skirmish against the Japanese raiders became a lesson in warfare. Each victory, however small, added another layer to his growing legend. The whispered conversations in military camps began to include his name. Commanders started to take notice of this fierce young warrior who seemed to carry fortune on his blade. Success in battle opened doors that birth alone could not. By his mid-30s, Choi Young had earned appointment to the Udalchi, the royal guard unit that protected the king himself. This was no ceremonial position for pampered nobles. These were the elite warriors who stood as the final shield between the throne and chaos. To join their ranks meant accepting a simple truth: you might die at any moment, but you would never retreat. The appointment came at a moment when such courage would be tested beyond all measure. King Gongmin had ascended to the throne with dreams of restoring Goryeo's independence and glory. But dreams, however noble, must contend with harsh reality. The kingdom seethed with internal rebellion, while external enemies circled like vultures sensing weakness. In 1352, just 1 year into Gongmin's reign, the first major test arrived in the form of Choi Il-shun's rebellion. Imagine the capital in chaos. Trusted officials revealing themselves as traitors, loyal soldiers uncertain whom to follow, and the young king's authority hanging by the thinnest of threads. This was the crucible that would transform Choi Young from a promising warrior into an indispensable guardian of the realm. The rebellion collapsed before Choi Young's fierce determination, like morning mist before the rising sun. His reward came swiftly, promotion to Hogan, then rapidly to Daehogan, marking him as one of the kingdom's premier military leaders. But fate had far greater trials in store. The next year brought an even more daunting challenge. The Yuan dynasty, that Mongol empire that had dominated East Asia for generations, faced internal rebellion from Chinese forces. In their desperation, they turned to their tributary state of Goryeo for military assistance. This was no request. Tributary states did not refuse their overlords. Choi Young found himself commanding Goryeo troops on foreign soil, fighting battles that would determine not just his own fate, but the delicate balance of power across the region. 27 times the armies clashed. 27 times Choi Young emerged victorious, each battle added to his growing legend. Each victory demonstrating that here was a commander who understood not just tactics and strategy, but the deeper art of inspiring men to fight beyond their limits. The enemy learned to fear the sight of his banners. His own soldiers learned to follow him with unquestioning loyalty, but Choi Young's greatest service to King Gongmen came not in distant lands, but in the dangerous game of defying the Yuan overlords themselves. The year 1356 marked a turning point in Goryeo's relationship with its Mongol masters. King Gongmen had grown weary of subjugation, and began implementing anti-Yuan policies, designed to restore true independence to his kingdom. The most dramatic of these actions came when Choi Young joined forces with the eunuch Indang to launch a daring cross-border raid. Picture the tension of that moment: Goryeo troops crossing the Yalu River under cover of darkness, striking directly at Yuan postal stations that served as symbols of foreign domination. This was more than military action. It was a declaration that Goryeo would no longer accept the role of a mere puppet state. The raid succeeded brilliantly, but its true significance lay in what it revealed about Choi Young's character. Here was a man willing to risk everything: his career, his life, his family's honor, for the principle of national independence. The boy who had lost his father at 16 had grown into a patriot who would sacrifice anything for his country's freedom. His reputation as the kingdom's premier defender grew with each passing crisis. When Japanese raiders struck the northwestern regions, Choi Young was there to meet them. When internal rebellions threatened the capital, his sword restored order. King Gongmin came to rely on him as other rulers might depend on a trusted brother, someone whose loyalty was absolute and whose competence was beyond question. But the greatest test was yet to come. In 1360, a new threat emerged from the north that would push both king and kingdom to the brink of destruction. The Red Turban army, Chinese rebels who had risen against Mongol rule, found themselves driven from their homeland and sought new territories to conquer. Their hungry eyes turned toward Goryeo, that prosperous peninsula kingdom that seemed ripe for conquest. The first invasion struck like a thunderbolt. These were no ordinary raiders seeking quick plunder. The Red Turban forces came as conquerors, determined to carve out a new empire from Goryeo's fertile lands. They swept across the border with overwhelming numbers, their red banners streaming in the wind like rivers of blood. The ancient city of Gaegyeong, the western capital, fell to their assault. Panic spread through the kingdom like wildfire. Here was an enemy that could not be bought off, negotiated with, or frightened away. They had come to stay, and only force of arms could drive them back. Choi Young stood with Yu Bang, Sil and other loyal commanders as they planned the counterattack that would determine their nation's fate. The odds seemed impossible, a disciplined enemy force occupying prepared positions, with supply lines stretching back to their base across the border. But impossibility had never stopped Choi Young before. The recapture of Gaegyeong became the stuff of legend. Through a combination of brilliant tactics, fierce courage, and relentless determination, Choi Young's forces not only retook the city, but pursued the fleeing enemy across the countryside, destroying their army so completely that survivors spoke of it in whispers for generations to come. Yet even as the kingdom celebrated this triumph, darker clouds gathered on the horizon. 2 years later, in 1362, the Red Turban forces returned with an even larger army, determined to succeed where they had previously failed. This time, their invasion force was so massive, so well organized, and so determined that even King Gongmin's court began preparing for the worst possible outcome. As reports of the approaching enemy reached the capital, panic seized the royal court. Officials packed their most precious belongings and prepared escape routes to the south. The king himself began making arrangements to abandon Gaegyeong and establish a temporary capital far from the advancing threat. In those desperate hours, when defeat seemed inevitable and flight appeared to be the only rational option, one voice rose in opposition. Choi Young stepped forward with words that would echo through history. "Your Majesty should remain a little longer, and recruit more soldiers to defend the royal cause." His meaning was clear: stand and fight, or lose everything that made Goryeo worth preserving. The king's advisors recoiled at such apparently reckless counsel. How could they risk the royal person in what might prove to be a hopeless battle? Better to preserve the dynasty by retreating to safety, then perhaps negotiate a settlement or wait for the enemy to overextend themselves. This was the voice of caution, of political calculation, of survival at any cost. But Choi Young saw deeper than mere survival. He understood that some things were worth more than life itself. A kingdom that abandoned its capital at the first sign of serious threat would never command respect from enemies or loyalty from subjects. The very act of fleeing would declare to the world that Goryeo had accepted defeat before the battle was even fought. Despite his passionate arguments, the king chose the path of retreat. The royal court packed hastily and fled southward to Bokju, present-day Andong, leaving the capital to its fate. Behind them, Gaegyeong fell to the Red Turban forces, its ancient palaces and temples echoing with the victory songs of foreign conquerors. Yet even in this moment of apparent defeat, Choi Young refused to accept failure. While others mourned the loss of the capital, he set about the hard work of organizing resistance. Scattered Goryeo forces were gathered and trained. Supply lines were established. Intelligence networks provided crucial information about enemy movements and weaknesses. Most importantly, the spirit of resistance was kept alive through the darkest hours. The recapture of Gaegyeong that followed stands as perhaps the finest example of Choi Young's military genius. Through careful planning, coordinated attacks, and the kind of inspiring leadership that turns ordinary soldiers into heroes, he not only liberated the capital, but did so with such decisive force that the enemy's will to continue fighting was completely shattered. But even as the kingdom celebrated the restoration of royal authority, fate prepared one final test that would demonstrate both Choi Young's unwavering loyalty and his capacity for swift, decisive action in moments of extreme crisis. The stage was set for an event that would shock the court and further cement his reputation as the realm's indispensable guardian. As King Gongmin returned in triumph to his reclaimed capital, the royal entourage stopped at Hyungwang Temple near Gaegyeong to rest before the final approach to the palace. It was March of 1363, and the spring air carried the sweet promise of renewal and peace. The Red Turban threat had been eliminated. The capital was secure. The kingdom seemed poised to enter a new golden age under its young, ambitious monarch. But in the depths of the night, when darkness cloaked treachery and loyal hearts slept in earned exhaustion, conspiracy struck like a serpent from the shadows. Kim Young, a trusted member of the king's inner circle, revealed his true nature in the most shocking possible way. The very man who should have been protecting his sovereign instead chose this moment of triumph to attempt regicide. The attack began at the fifth watch, when the night was deepest and guards were most likely to be drowsy. 50 armed conspirators, moving with the practiced stealth of assassins, surrounded the temporary royal quarters. Their plan was simple and brutal: eliminate the king and seize power in the chaos that would follow. Terror gripped the temple compound as the assault began. Royal guards, caught completely off guard by an attack from within their own ranks, scattered in panic. The trusted officials who should have been organizing resistance instead became the first victims of the conspirators' blades. Eunuch Kanduchi fell, then Chief Council member Wang Ji, then Judge of the Rectification Office Kim Han Ryong. The conspiracy seemed to be succeeding beyond its organizers' wildest dreams in those desperate moments. As loyalty crumbled and treachery triumphed, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the night air like thunder. Choi Young had received word of the attack, and was racing from Gaegyeong, with whatever forces he could quickly assemble. With him rode Deputy Commissioner Yu Ji, Chief Controller and Yu Jeong, and Senior Guard Commander Kim Jang-soo, men whose names would be remembered alongside his own for their courage in this darkest hour. The battle that followed was swift but savage. The conspirators, for all their planning and preparation, had not anticipated facing Choi Young's disciplined force. Their surprise attack had been designed to overwhelm confused and scattered defenders, not to fight a pitched battle against organized resistance led by the kingdom's most capable military commander. One by one, the conspirators fell before the righteous fury of loyal swords. Kim Young's grand scheme collapsed like a house built on sand, his followers either dead or fleeing into the darkness. The king was saved, the conspiracy crushed, and order restored through the swift action of men who understood that some betrayals could never be forgiven or forgotten. For this service, Choi Young received the highest honor the kingdom could bestow, designation as a first-class merit subject, with his portrait to be displayed permanently in the Hall of Merit. But more important than any formal recognition was the clear demonstration that he had become indispensable to the realm's survival. When crisis struck, when loyalty wavered, when treachery threatened to triumph, Choi Young was the rock upon which the kingdom's hopes could rest. The years that followed would bring new challenges, greater responsibilities, and even more dramatic tests of his character and abilities. But on that spring night in 1363, as dawn broke over Hyungwang Temple, and the king prepared to complete his triumphant return to Gaegyeong, one truth had become crystal clear to all who witnessed these events. In an age of chaos and betrayal, when even trusted advisors could reveal themselves as deadly enemies, Choi Young stood as an immovable pillar of loyalty and strength. Whatever storms might come, whatever enemies might threaten, whatever crises might shake the very foundations of the realm, this was the man who would stand guard over Goryeo's survival. The boy who had lost his father at 16, had become the father figure upon whom an entire kingdom depended. The young soldier who had fought Japanese raiders on remote beaches, had evolved into the supreme guardian of the realm's independence and honor. Every battle fought, every crisis weathered, every moment of testing had prepared him for the greater trials that lay ahead. But even as we celebrate these early triumphs, we must remember that this is only the beginning of Choi Young's story. Greater challenges await, political intrigue that will test his wisdom, military campaigns that will push his abilities to their limits, and ultimately, choices that will determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of the kingdom he serves. The Red Turban threat has been eliminated, but new enemies are already gathering their strength beyond the northern borders. The king's authority has been restored, but the forces of internal dissent are regrouping in the shadows. Most ominously of all, the great Yuan Empire is beginning to show signs of weakness, creating a power vacuum that ambitious rivals will soon seek to fill. As night falls over the reclaimed capital, and King Gongmin settles once again upon his rightful throne, Choi Young stands watch from the palace walls. His keen eyes scan the horizon, alert for any sign of new threats. His weathered hands rest easily upon his sword hilt, ready to draw steel in defense of the realm at a moment's notice. The young man who began this journey with nothing but determination and a dead father's final blessing has become the kingdom's greatest asset. But the greatest tests of his loyalty, his wisdom, and his strength still lie ahead, waiting in the shadows of an uncertain future. Yet even in dreams, time flows forward, and destiny never rests. The wheel of fortune turns relentlessly, and even the mightiest heroes must face their darkest hours. As we continue Choi Young's story, we find him standing at the pinnacle of royal favor. Yet fate was already weaving the threads of his greatest trial. The Red Turban threat had been vanquished. But like a hydra from ancient myth, it would soon return with twice the fury and 10 times the determination. The year 1364 brought troubling news from across the northern borders. Yuan dynasty intelligence networks reported massive Red Turban forces regrouping in the Chinese heartland. Their ranks swollen with desperate refugees, hardened veterans, and ambitious warlords who saw Goryeo's wealth as the answer to all their problems. This would not be another raid or opportunistic invasion. This would be total war by winter's end. The scope of the approaching catastrophe became clear. Nearly 10,000 Red Turban warriors had massed along the Yalu River. Their numbers including not just Chinese rebels but Mongol deserters, Korean expatriates with old grievances, and mercenaries from across the steppes. Their leader, Liu Futong, had proclaimed himself emperor, and declared his intention to establish a new dynasty with Goryeo as its first conquered territory. When the invasion began in earnest, it unfolded with terrifying efficiency. The Red Turban forces crossed the frozen Yalu in 3 massive columns, each one larger than the entire army that had captured Gaegyeong just 2 years earlier. Their advanced scouts had mapped every mountain pass, every river crossing, every fortress that might slow their progress. This was no wild barbarian raid, it was a calculated campaign of conquest executed with military precision. The speed of their advance caught even Choi Young off guard. Within days, Red Turban banners flew over half a dozen border towns. Within a week, their forward elements were probing the outer defenses of major cities. The royal court, which had grown comfortable in the afterglow of previous victories, suddenly found itself facing the very real possibility of complete annihilation. King Gongmin summoned his council in emergency session as reports of defeat poured in from the northern provinces. The great hall that had recently echoed with celebration now rang with arguments, recriminations, and barely concealed panic. Some officials demanded immediate mobilization of every available soldier. Others insisted that diplomatic solutions must be explored before resorting to warfare. Still others whispered that perhaps the time had come to consider terms of surrender. In this cacophony of fear and indecision, one voice cut through the chaos with steel-edged clarity. Choi Young rose from his place among the military commanders, and addressed his sovereign with words that would be remembered long after the crisis had passed. Your Majesty should remain steadfast and recruit soldiers to defend our ancestral land. We shall not yield one step to these invaders. His confidence was magnificent, but it could not change the harsh mathematics of warfare. The enemy outnumbered Goryeo's immediately available forces by at least 3-1. They possessed superior knowledge of the terrain through which they were advancing. Most importantly, they carried the desperate energy of men who had nothing left to lose. The most dangerous enemy any commander can face, despite Choi Young's passionate advocacy for resistance. The king's other advisors painted an increasingly grim picture of the military situation. The Red Turban forces were advancing on multiple fronts, making it impossible to concentrate Goryeo's strength at any single decisive point. Even if every available soldier were thrown into battle immediately, there was no guarantee that the kingdom's forces could halt the invasion before it reached the capital itself. The debate raged through the night and into the following day. Maps were consulted, supply calculations reviewed, and messenger reports analyzed with desperate intensity. But beneath all the technical discussions lay a single, terrible question: Could Goryeo's military might, however courageously deployed, prevail against such overwhelming odds? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. A bloodied courier stumbled into the royal presence with news that shattered whatever illusions remained about the kingdom's ability to mount an effective defense. The Red Turban forces had not only broken through the border defenses, they had already begun their final advance toward Gaegyeong itself. The capital lay less than 3 days' march from the approaching enemy vanguard, in that moment of ultimate crisis, when the very survival of the dynasty hung in the balance. King Gongmin made the decision that would define the remainder of his reign. The royal court would evacuate immediately to Bokshu, far to the south, where temporary safety might be found while the military situation developed. It was, his advisors assured him, merely a strategic withdrawal, a temporary measure to preserve the royal person while loyal forces regrouped for a decisive counterattack. Choi Young listened to these rationalizations with growing horror. He understood, as perhaps no one else in that panicked assembly truly did, that some defeats are worse than death itself. A king who abandoned his capital, who fled before the enemy had even approached the city walls, would forfeit not just territory but legitimacy itself. How could such a monarch ever again command the loyalty of his subjects or the respect of foreign powers? His final plea rang through the great hall with prophetic intensity. If your majesty departs now, the kingdom itself departs with you. Better to die defending what we have built, than to live as exiles in our own land. These were not the words of a reckless hothead seeking glorious death, but of a strategic thinker who grasped the deeper implications of the choice before them. Yet the die was already cast. Within hours, the royal household began its hasty evacuation southward, leaving behind not just a city, but the very idea of Goryeo as an independent kingdom capable of defending itself. Wagons loaded with court treasures rolled through the gates while behind them, ordinary citizens watched their sovereign abandon them to whatever fate the approaching invaders might decree. Choi Young remained in the capital as long as possible, organizing whatever resistance could be mounted by the forces left behind. But even his legendary determination could not overcome the fundamental reality that a kingdom whose king had fled could not inspire the kind of desperate courage necessary to work miracles against impossible odds. When the Red Turban vanguard finally appeared on the hills overlooking Gaegyeong, they found a city already half defeated by despair. The occupation that followed was swift but not merciful. The Red Turban forces had learned from their previous failures in Goryeo, and were determined to establish control so complete that future rebellion would be impossible. They systematically dismantled the administrative structures that had governed the kingdom for centuries, replacing Korean officials with their own appointees and imposing new laws designed to transform conquered territory into a permanent addition to their emerging empire. Yet even in this darkest hour, when foreign banners flew over the royal palace, and enemy patrols marched through streets that had known only Korean rule for 400 years, the spark of resistance was not extinguished. In hidden camps scattered throughout the countryside, loyal commanders gathered the scattered remnants of the royal army. Supply caches were established in remote mountain valleys. Intelligence networks continued to operate, feeding crucial information about enemy movements and weaknesses to resistance leaders. At the heart of this underground war stood Choi Young, no longer the king's favored general, but something far more important, the living embodiment of Goryeo's refusal to accept permanent defeat. Day by day, week by week, he built the foundation for what would become one of the most remarkable military comebacks in Korean history. The work was painstaking and dangerous. Every recruit had to be carefully vetted to ensure that Red Turban spies had not infiltrated the resistance networks. Weapons and supplies had to be smuggled past enemy patrols without arousing suspicion. Most challenging of all, the morale of dispirited soldiers had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Men who had seen their king flee and their capital fall needed new reasons to believe that victory was still possible. Choi Young proved himself a master of this kind of unconventional warfare. He understood that the enemy's greatest strength, their overwhelming numerical superiority, could also become a fatal weakness if properly exploited. Large armies require enormous amounts of food, water, and other supplies. They move slowly and predictably. Most importantly, they grow complacent when victory seems assured and resistance appears to have collapsed. The first small strikes came like lightning from a clear sky. Red Turban supply convoys found themselves under attack from forces that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Isolated garrisons were overwhelmed in swift night raids that left no prisoners to reveal the attacker's identity or intentions. Communication lines between the main enemy force and its forward elements were systematically disrupted, creating confusion and uncertainty in the invaders' command structure. Each successful operation brought new recruits to the resistance cause. Farmers whose crops had been confiscated by the occupiers took up weapons alongside professional soldiers. Merchants whose businesses had been destroyed by the invasion provided crucial intelligence about enemy movements. Even Buddhist monks, normally dedicated to peaceful contemplation, found ways to support the growing rebellion against foreign rule. But Choi Young knew that guerrilla tactics alone could never fully liberate the kingdom. At some point, the resistance would need to transform itself from a collection of scattered bands into a proper army capable of fighting pitched battles against the Red Turbans main force. This transformation would require not just weapons and trained soldiers, but something far more precious: hope that victory was actually achievable. That hope began to take shape in the form of a carefully planned assault on Gaegyeong itself. The operation would be enormously risky, potentially catastrophic if it failed, but absolutely essential for restoring Goryeo's psychological momentum. A successful recapture of the capital would demonstrate to friend and foe alike that the Red Turban occupation was not permanent, that Korean resistance remained a force to be reckoned with, and that ultimate victory was still within reach. The planning took months of careful preparation. Detailed intelligence about enemy troop dispositions had to be gathered and verified. Precise timing was essential. The attack would need to be coordinated across multiple fronts simultaneously to prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces at any single point. Most crucially, the assault force would need to achieve complete surprise, since any advance warning would allow the enemy to prepare defenses that could make the city impregnable. When the moment finally arrived, it came with the fury of a winter storm unleashed upon an unsuspecting landscape. Choi Young's forces struck from 4 directions at once, their carefully coordinated attacks overwhelming the Red Turban defenders before they could mount an effective response. The months of guerrilla warfare had taught the resistance fighters lessons in speed and violence that now paid dividends in the most critical battle of the war. The fighting that raged through Gaegyeong streets was savage but brief. Red Turban commanders, comfortable in their assumption that Korean resistance had been permanently crushed, found themselves facing an enemy that fought with the desperate intensity of patriots defending their homeland. Their troops, many of whom had grown soft during the long occupation, could not match the fury of soldiers who saw this battle as their last chance to reclaim their country's honor. By dawn, Korean banners once again flew over the royal palace. The Red Turban forces that had seemed so invincible were either dead, captured, or fleeing northward in complete disarray. The liberation of Gaegyeong was complete, accomplished with such decisive force that the enemy's will to continue fighting was utterly shattered. News of the victory spread across the peninsula like wildfire, reaching even the king's exile court in distant Bokju. For King Gongmin, the recapture of his capital represented both vindication and humiliation. Vindication of his kingdom's ultimate strength, but humiliation at his own absence during its greatest hour of triumph. The general he had left behind had accomplished what he himself had not believed possible. The king's return to Gaegyeong was staged as a grand triumph, complete with ceremonial processions and elaborate celebrations. But those who witnessed the reunion between sovereign and general understood the subtle shift in their relationship that had taken place during the months of separation. Choi Young had saved not just the capital, but the very concept of Goryeo's independence. Such service creates bonds that transcend ordinary loyalty, and obligations that extend far beyond normal expectations. The victory celebrations had barely ended when a new crisis erupted. One that would test both men's characters in ways they had never imagined. As King Gongmin's entourage made its way back to the reclaimed palace, they paused for rest at Unwind Temple, just outside the capital. It was a moment that should have been filled with joy and relief, the king returning in triumph to his liberated realm. The greatest external threat defeated, and the future bright with promise. Instead, it became a nightmare that would haunt the royal court for years to come. In the depths of the night, when even the most vigilant guards might be expected to relax their watchfulness, treachery struck from the most unexpected quarter. Kim Young, a trusted member of the king's inner circle who had accompanied the royal party throughout their exile, revealed himself as something far more dangerous than any foreign enemy, a traitor willing to murder his own sovereign for personal gain. The conspiracy Kim Young had organized was both simple and diabolical in its conception. With the king isolated in temporary quarters away from the palace's normal security arrangements, a small force of determined assassins could potentially succeed where vast foreign armies had failed. The plan called for 50 armed conspirators to surround the royal lodgings at the darkest hour of the night, when resistance would be minimal and escape impossible. The attack began with the systematic elimination of the king's immediate protectors. Yuna Kanduchi, who slept in the chamber closest to the royal quarters, was the first to die. Chief Council member Wang Jie fell next, his throat cut before he could raise an alarm. Judge Kim Han Ryong of the Palace Rectification Office died trying to reach his sword, struck down before he could defend either himself or his sovereign. With the inner defenses breached and the king's most trusted advisors lying dead, the conspirators moved toward their ultimate objective. Kim Young himself led the final assault, his face twisted with the kind of fanatical determination that makes ordinary men capable of extraordinary evil. In his mind, the deed was already accomplished. The king would die, the government would collapse into chaos, and from that chaos would emerge new opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. But Kim Young had made one fatal miscalculation. His conspiracy had been built on the assumption that Choi Young, like the king himself, had grown soft and complacent in the afterglow of recent victories. The general who had liberated Gaegyeong through months of patient planning and savage fighting, was presumably back in the capital, celebrating his triumph and basking in royal favor. Instead, Choi Young had remained vigilant, his warrior's instincts alert to dangers that others might overlook. When word of the attack reached him in Gaegyeong, his response was immediate and devastating. Within minutes, he was racing through the darkness with whatever forces he could quickly assemble: Deputy Commissioner Yuji, Chief Controller, and Yu Jeong, Senior Guard Commander Kim Jang-soo, and a corps of elite soldiers whose loyalty was beyond question. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the conspirators' confidence like a hammer striking glass. They had planned for a quick assassination followed by a controlled seizure of power. They had not prepared for a pitched battle against the kingdom's most formidable military commander and his hand-picked warriors. The fighting that erupted around Unwind Temple was brief but savage. Kim Young's conspirators, for all their planning and preparation, were essentially court officials and palace guards, who had never faced truly experienced combat veterans in mortal combat. Choi Young's force, by contrast, consisted of men who had survived the Red Turban Wars, the border conflicts with UN forces, and countless smaller engagements that had honed their skills to razor sharpness. One by one, the conspirators fell before the righteous fury of loyal swords. Kim Young himself, the architect of this treacherous scheme, died with his dreams of power unfulfilled, and his name forever linked with the basest form of betrayal. The temple grounds, which should have been a place of peace and spiritual contemplation, became a battlefield where loyalty triumphed over treachery and order was restored through the swift application of justice. When dawn broke over the scene of carnage, King Gongmin emerged from his ordeal with a new understanding of both his own vulnerability and his general's indispensable value. The conspiracy had failed, but its very existence revealed how fragile the bonds of loyalty could be in an age of political upheaval. Without Choi Young's swift intervention, the entire course of Korean history might have been altered by a handful of ambitious traitors. The formal recognition that followed was both magnificent and inevitable. Choi Young was elevated to the status of a first-class merit subject, the highest honor the kingdom could bestow upon any individual. His portrait would be displayed permanently in the Hall of Merit, ensuring that future generations would remember his service to the realm. More immediately, his position as the kingdom's supreme military commander was now beyond challenge or question. Yet even as the court celebrated this latest triumph over the forces of chaos and treason, new challenges were already beginning to emerge on the horizon. The Yuan dynasty, that great Mongol empire that had dominated East Asia for over a century, was showing signs of internal weakness that ambitious neighbors were sure to exploit. The Red Turban movement, though defeated in Goryeo, continued to ravage Chinese territories, and might return with renewed strength. Most ominously, ambitious commanders within Goryeo itself might begin to see opportunities for personnel advancement in the changing regional balance of power. For now, however, the kingdom could celebrate the fact that it had survived its greatest trial intact. The Red Turban invasion had been repelled, the capital liberated, and internal treachery defeated. King Gongmin sat once again upon his rightful throne, surrounded by loyal ministers and protected by proven warriors. The future might hold new challenges, but they would be met by a nation that had discovered the full extent of its own strength and resilience. At the center of this restored stability stood Choi Young, no longer merely a promising general, but the proven guardian of the realm's independence and honor. Every crisis weathered, every battle won, every moment of testing had prepared him for even greater responsibilities that lay ahead. The boy who had lost his father at 16 had become the father figure upon whom an entire kingdom depended. But even as we celebrate these triumphs, we must remember that this is still only the middle of Choi Young's story. Greater challenges await, political changes that will test his wisdom, military campaigns that will push his abilities to their absolute limits, and ultimately, choices that will determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of the kingdom he has sworn to protect. The wheel of fortune continues to turn, and even the mightiest heroes must face their ultimate trials. In the shadows of an uncertain future, new enemies are gathering their strength, new ambitions are taking shape, and new tests of loyalty and courage are being prepared by the inexorable hand of fate. But even peaceful memories carry shadows. In the quiet corners of power, something darker often takes root. Power, they say, is the most intoxicating of all poisons. It can transform wise men into tyrants and loyal servants into bitter enemies. As we continue Choi Young's story, we witness how even the most devoted guardian can find himself cast into the wilderness of political exile, only to emerge stronger and more determined than ever before. The year 1364 marked the beginning of a new chapter in Goryeo's political landscape, one that would test every lesson Choi Young had learned about loyalty, survival, and the price of unwavering principle. King Gongmin, having witnessed firsthand how quickly trusted advisors could transform into deadly enemies, began to seek new ways to maintain his grip on power, while preventing any single individual from accumulating too much influence. The king's solution came in the form of an unlikely figure named Sindon, a man so removed from conventional court politics that his contemporaries described him as one who stands apart from the world, alone and isolated. This mysterious monk possessed neither noble blood, military experience, nor administrative background. What he did have was something far more valuable in the king's eyes: complete independence from the existing power structures that had produced so many conspiracies and betrayals. Sinden's rise was as meteoric as it was controversial. Within months of his appointment to high office, he had begun implementing radical reforms designed to break the traditional networks of influence that connected military commanders, civil officials, and aristocratic families. His policies targeted corruption with ruthless efficiency, but they also created powerful enemies among those whose privileges were being systematically dismantled. For Choi Young, Sinden's ascendancy represented a profound personal crisis. The general who had saved the kingdom from foreign invasion and internal treachery suddenly found himself viewed with suspicion by the very monarch he had served so faithfully. The king who had once depended on his military prowess now seemed to regard that same strength as a potential threat to royal authority. The first sign of trouble came through whispered accusations rather than formal charges. Court gossips began spreading rumors about Choi Young's alleged ambitions, his supposed disloyalty, and his imagined plots against the throne. These whispers carried no evidence and violated every principle of justice, but they served their intended purpose, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that made the king question even his most faithful servants. The actual fall came swiftly and without warning. One morning, Choi Young arrived at court to find himself stripped of his military commands and reassigned to a minor provincial post as Gaegyeong, essentially a ceremonial governor of a distant region. The man who had liberated the capital and saved the king's life was being exiled to administrative obscurity on the basis of anonymous accusations and political calculation. Worse was yet to come. Even this diminished position proved insufficient to satisfy Sinden's determination to neutralize potential rivals. New accusations emerged, more serious than the first, claiming that Choi Young had engaged in treasonous correspondence with foreign powers. These charges were as fabricated as they were devastating. They stripped him of all official titles and condemned him to formal exile far from the capital he had fought so hard to defend. The exile years tested Choi Young's character in ways that battlefield courage never could. Physical bravery comes naturally to warrior spirits, but enduring unjust disgrace while maintaining faith in ultimate vindication requires a different kind of strength entirely. Day after day, month after month, he lived with the knowledge that his life's work had been dismissed, his reputation destroyed, and his services to the kingdom forgotten by the very people he had saved. Yet even in the depths of political exile, Choi Young never abandoned his fundamental loyalty to Goryeo itself. He understood the difference between serving a king and serving a kingdom, between personal devotion and patriotic duty. Kings might make mistakes, courtiers might spread lies, and political fortunes might rise and fall like ocean tides. But the land itself remained constant and worthy of protection. His vindication came through the very forces that had brought about his downfall. Sinden's radical reforms, however well-intentioned, had created so many enemies and caused so much disruption that even King Gongmin began to question their wisdom. The monk's austere lifestyle and contempt for conventional politics, initially seen as virtues, gradually revealed themselves as liabilities that prevented effective governance. The final blow to Sinden's power came from an unexpected quarter: his own inflexibility. When presented with evidence that some of his policies were causing genuine harm to the kingdom's stability, he refused to consider any modifications or compromises. This rigidity, combined with growing opposition from virtually every segment of society, made his position ultimately untenable. In 1371, Sinden fell from power as suddenly as he had risen. His political career destroyed by the same forces of change he had tried to master. Within weeks of his disgrace,
Messengers were racing across the peninsula carrying royal pardons and restoration orders for those who had been unjustly exiled during the monks' ascendancy. Choi Young's name was prominent among them. The general's return to court was both triumphant and sobering. He was welcomed back with all the honors due to his rank and service, his military commands restored, and his reputation officially cleared of all stains. Yet the experience of exile had changed him in subtle but profound ways. He now understood that political loyalty, however sincere, offered no protection against the whims of royal favor and the machinations of ambitious courtiers. His hard-earned wisdom would prove invaluable in the trials that lay ahead. In 1374, a new crisis erupted that would test both Choi Young's military skills and his understanding of the kingdom's complex internal dynamics. The island of Jeju, that strategic outpost in the southern seas, had become home to a community of Mongol herders known as Wokou, who had settled there during the height of Yuan power. These Mongol settlers had lived peacefully under Goryeo rule for decades, contributing to the island's economy while maintaining their traditional pastoral lifestyle. But as Yuan influence waned and political tensions increased across the region, some among them began to dream of independence or perhaps reunion with their Mongol homeland. These dreams eventually crystallized into open rebellion against Korean authority. The Jeju uprising was unlike any conflict Choi Young had previously faced. This was not a foreign invasion that could be repelled through conventional military tactics, nor a court conspiracy that could be defeated through swift political action. Instead, it was a complex internal revolt that combined ethnic tensions, economic grievances, and separatist ambitions in ways that defied simple solutions. King Gongmin's response was characteristically decisive. He appointed Choi Young as supreme commander of all forces in the southern provinces, and gave him complete authority to resolve the crisis by whatever means he deemed necessary. This appointment represented not just royal confidence in the general's abilities, but recognition that some problems required the kind of ruthless efficiency that only a proven warrior could provide. The campaign that followed revealed new dimensions of Choi Young's character. The man who had shown mercy to defeated enemies and restraint in political conflicts now faced rebels who seemed determined to fight to the last person rather than accept any negotiated settlement. The Mongol settlers, knowing that defeat might mean exile or worse, chose to resist with the desperate courage of people who had nothing left to lose. The fighting was savage and unforgiving. Unlike conventional battles between organized armies, this conflict involved the systematic pacification of an entire island population that had chosen resistance over submission. Every village, every stronghold, every mountain refuge had to be cleared through force of arms. The rebels, though outnumbered and outgunned, used their intimate knowledge of local terrain to mount a defense that extracted a terrible price from their attackers. Choi Young's response was methodical and merciless. He understood that half measures would only prolong the conflict and increase casualties on both sides. The rebellion had to be crushed so completely that no future generation would consider following the same path. This meant not just defeating the rebel forces in battle, but destroying their will to continue fighting through demonstrations of overwhelming force. The campaign's end came not with a climactic battle, but with the systematic reduction of the rebels' final strongholds. One by one, their mountain fortresses fell to coordinated assaults that left no survivors to carry tales of resistance to future generations. The last Wokou rebels died fighting rather than surrendering, their desperate courage earning them a warrior's death, if not a warrior's victory. When Choi Young returned to the mainland, he brought with him the kind of complete victory that left no ambiguity about the outcome. The Jeju rebellion had been extinguished so thoroughly that the island would remain peaceful for the rest of the dynasty. Yet the cost of this success was measured not just in casualties but in the hardening of the general's own character. The man who returned from Jeju was more ruthless, more calculating,
and more willing to employ whatever methods served the kingdom's interests.
His transformation would prove prophetic.
For even as Choi Young was suppressing the last embers of rebellion in the south,
events were unfolding in the capital
that would change the course of Korean history forever.
King Gongmin,
the monarch who had survived foreign invasion, internal conspiracy, and political upheaval,
finally succumbed to a threat he had never fully recognized.
The very guards he had trusted with his personal safety, the royal bodyguard unit known as the Gaegyeong, had been formed from young nobles chosen for their loyalty and courage. They were intended to serve as an elite protection force that would prevent repetitions of earlier assassination attempts. Instead, they became the instruments of the king's destruction, their intimate access to the royal person making them the most dangerous enemies imaginable. The assassination itself was swift and shocking in its audacity. In the depths of the night, when even the most vigilant security measures are at their weakest, members of the Gaegyeong struck down the king they had sworn to protect. The deed was accomplished with such speed and stealth that no alarm was raised until it was far too late to prevent the ultimate tragedy. Notice of King Gongmin's death reached Choi Young like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. The monarch he had served through exile and restoration, through crisis and triumph, through the best and worst moments of a tumultuous reign, was gone. More than personal grief, however, was the immediate recognition that the kingdom now faced its greatest political crisis since the Red Turban invasions. The succession that followed brought King Yu to the throne, a young monarch whose legitimacy was immediately questioned by those who knew the complex circumstances of his birth. Rumors swirled through the court about his true parentage, with some claiming he was actually the son of a Mongol prince, rather than the legitimate heir to the Goryeo throne. These whispers would shadow his entire reign, and eventually contribute to his downfall.
For Choi Young,
the new king's accession represented both opportunity and challenge. King Yu clearly needed experienced advisors who could help him navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics. And few individuals possessed more relevant experience than the general who had served his predecessor through every conceivable crisis. Yet the same experience that made Choi Young valuable also made him potentially dangerous. A man who had wielded such influence under one king might prove difficult to control under another. The early years of King Yu's reign saw Choi Young's influence grow steadily as he demonstrated his continued military prowess and political acumen. The Japanese raids that had plagued Korea's coasts for decades provided numerous opportunities for the veteran general to prove his worth to the new monarch. Victory followed victory as Choi Young's forces systematically eliminated pirate bases and disrupted the maritime networks that had made such raids possible. The greatest of these triumphs came at Hongsan, where Choi Young engineered a devastating defeat of Japanese forces that effectively ended large-scale raids along Korea's western coast. The Battle of Hongsan became legendary, not just for its strategic importance, but for the tactical brilliance with which it was conducted.
Choi Young's careful positioning of his forces,
his timing of the decisive assault,
and his ability to coordinate complex maneuvers under battlefield conditions,
all demonstrated why he was regarded as the kingdom's premier military commander.
Yet even as external enemies
fell before his sword, internal challenges were mounting that would test his political skills as much as his military abilities. The court of King Yu was divided between competing factions, each seeking to advance their own interests while claiming to serve the greater good. At the center of these intrigues stood Yi Seong-gye, a powerful minister whose influence over the young king was both extensive and controversial.
Yi Seong-gye represented everything that
Choi Young had learned to distrust about court politics.
He was smooth where the general was direct,
calculating where the warrior was straightforward, and willing to compromise where the soldier demanded absolute standards. Their relationship began as professional cooperation, but gradually deteriorated into barely concealed hostility, as their fundamental differences in approach became impossible to ignore. The struggle between these two powerful figures would define much of King Yu's reign.
Yi, in Irime, sought to centralize power in civilian hands and reduce the military's traditional influence over policy decisions.
Choi Young, by contrast, believed that the kingdom's survival depended
on maintaining strong defenses and clear
chains of military command. Their conflict was not just personal but philosophical, representing competing visions of how Goryeo should be governed in an increasingly dangerous world. The resolution of this struggle came through a series of political maneuvers that demonstrated Choi Young's growing sophistication in the arts of court intrigue. Rather than challenging Yi directly, which might have forced King Yu to choose between them, the general chose to wait for his rival to make crucial mistakes. When those mistakes inevitably came, Choi Young was ready to exploit them with the same precision he brought to military campaigns.
The final confrontation occurred in 1388,
when Yi and Irim's followers overreached themselves in a land dispute that revealed their corruption and abuse of power.
Choi Young struck with devastating efficiency, eliminating not just Yi and
Im himself, but his entire network of supporters and clients.
The purge was so complete that no trace of the minister's influence remained in the government structure. With his political rivals eliminated, Choi Young reached the pinnacle of his power and influence.
King Yu, now dependent on the general's military strength and political acumen, granted him unprecedented authority over both domestic and foreign policy.
The culmination of this favor came when Choi Young's daughter was chosen as a royal consort, creating family ties that seemed to guarantee his position for the foreseeable future. Yet even as Choi Young savored his triumph over internal enemies, far greater challenges were gathering on the horizon.
The Ming dynasty, that new Chinese empire that had emerged from the ashes of Mongol rule,
was beginning to assert its own vision of regional order. Their demands would soon force Goryeo to choose between submission and resistance, between survival and honor,
between the certainty of peace and the terrible risks of war.
In the royal palace that had witnessed so many moments of crisis and triumph, Choi Young stood at the height of his influence while storm clouds gathered beyond the northern borders.
The boy who had lost his father at 16,
the young soldier who had fought pirates on distant shores,
the exile who had endured political disgrace,
and the general who had saved kingdoms,
had finally achieved the power to shape his nation's destiny.
But with great power comes great responsibility,
and the choices that lay ahead
would test not just Choi Young's military genius and political skill,
but his fundamental understanding of loyalty,
honor,
and the price that must sometimes be paid for principle.
The greatest trial of his life was about to begin,
and its outcome would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the kingdom he had spent his entire adult life defending.
The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries, pitting the iron will of a Korean general against the overwhelming power of a Chinese empire.
In this ultimate test, there could be no compromise, no negotiation, and no retreat.
Everything Choi Young had fought for, everything he believed in,
and everything he held dear would be placed at
risk in a gamble
that would either secure his nation's independence or ensure its destruction.
Some memories arrive like gentle echoes,
but others come like turning winds,
quiet at first, then undeniable.
Destiny arrives not with fanfare, but with a simple message that changes everything.
In February of 1388, as winter's grip loosened on the Korean peninsula,
a travel-worn envoy named Seol Jang-soo returned from the Ming capital bearing words that would ignite the final chapter of Choi Young's extraordinary life.
The message he carried seemed routine enough,
a diplomatic communication from the Chinese emperor to his Korean tributary.
Yet within those formal phrases lay the seeds of a conflict that would reshape the entire region. The territory north of Tiling originally belonged to the Yuan dynasty, and should therefore be returned to Liaodong province. These 23 words would prove more devastating than any army,
more decisive than any battle, more final than any sword thrust.
The Ming Empire, having consolidated its control over China proper, now turned its attention to the peripheral territories that had once acknowledged Mongol authority. The implications were staggering. Teeling lay deep within what every Korean considered to be ancestral territory, land that had been settled by Korean farmers for generations, and defended by Korean soldiers through countless conflicts. To surrender it would mean abandoning not just territory, but people, Korean families who had lived there for centuries. Korean villages with their temples and ancestral graves. Korean culture rooted in soil watered by Korean blood. When King Yi convened his council to consider this ultimatum, the Great Hall buzzed with heated debate. The majority of court officials, led by the cautious voices of experienced diplomats, argued for compliance with Ming demands. They painted vivid pictures of Chinese armies sweeping across the peninsula, of cities burning under foreign occupation, of a kingdom destroyed by prideful resistance to impossible odds. We are but a small nation, they argued. How can we stand against the might of the Middle Kingdom? Better to yield disputed territory than to lose everything through futile defiance. Wise rulers know when to bend rather than break. Their arguments carried the weight of cold logic and bitter experience. The Ming dynasty commanded resources that dwarfed anything Goryeo could mobilize. Their armies had proven themselves in the conquest of China. Their generals had learned their craft in the crucible of dynastic warfare. And their emperor had demonstrated both the will and the ability to crush resistance wherever it emerged. But at the far end of the council table sat a man for whom such calculations meant nothing beside the call of honor and duty. Choi Young listened to the voices of accommodation with growing disgust. His weathered hands clenched into fists as speaker after speaker advocated surrender in the name of pragmatism. When his turn came to address the council, the old general's voice cut through the chamber like a blade drawn from its scabbard. "There are worse fates than death," he declared, his eyes blazing with the fire that had carried him through 4 decades of warfare. "A nation that yields its ancestral territory without a fight, declares to the world that it has no right to exist. If we must die, let us die as Koreans defending Korean soil." The debate that followed raged 4 days, splitting the court into irreconcilable factions. The Peace Party, led by veteran diplomat Yi Seong-gye, marshaled every argument of prudence and survival. They spoke of the kingdom's obligations to its people, of the folly of sacrificing the certain for the uncertain, of the wisdom that comes from recognizing one's limitations. Choi Young's response was characteristically direct and uncompromising. When Yi Seong-gye argued that resistance would bring catastrophe upon the innocent, the general's reply silenced the entire assembly. What greater catastrophe could befall our people than to wake up one morning as subjects of a foreign empire? Their children learning foreign customs, their ancestors' graves tended by foreign hands. The king found himself torn between competing visions of his duty. As a ruler, he was responsible for his subjects' welfare and survival. As a Korean, he was the guardian of 1,000 years of independence and cultural identity. The choice he faced was not just political but existential. What did it mean to be Korean if Korea ceased to resist threats to its sovereignty? In the end, Choi Young's arguments proved decisive. The general's reputation for military genius, combined with his absolute certainty that victory was possible, swayed the king toward the path of resistance. The decision was formalized in a royal decree that would echo through history. Goryeo would not yield 1 inch of ancestral territory to foreign demands, regardless of the consequences. With the day cast for war, Choi Young threw himself into preparations with the methodical intensity that had marked all his great campaigns. Every province received mobilization orders. Every military unit was brought to full strength. Even Buddhist monasteries, traditionally exempt from military service, were required to provide men for the coming struggle. The army that assembled under Choi Young's command was the largest military force Goryeo had ever fielded. Nearly 40,000 soldiers gathered at the staging areas, their ranks including seasoned veterans of the Japanese campaigns alongside raw recruits who had never seen battle. Supporting them were over 11,000 support personnel, kuksi, mediksi, supply handlers, and scouts whose efforts would determine whether the army could sustain itself during a lengthy campaign. The logistics alone were staggering. More than 21,000 horses were assembled to provide mobility for the cavalry units and transport for the supply trains. Weapons had to be manufactured or requisitioned from storage. Food supplies sufficient for months of campaigning had to be accumulated and organized for efficient distribution. Maps of the disputed territory had to be prepared and distributed to unit commanders. Choi Young appointed himself as supreme commander of all forces, a decision that reflected both his confidence in ultimate victory and his understanding that this campaign would require unprecedented coordination between different military units. Under him, he placed two capable subordinates, Cho Min-soo as commander of the left wing, and Yi Seong-gye as commander of the right wing. The choice of Yi Seong-gye would prove fateful in ways that none could have anticipated. This rising general had distinguished himself in numerous campaigns against Japanese raiders and Mongol remnants, earning a reputation for tactical brilliance and personal courage. His appointment to such a crucial position seemed natural, given his record of service and his apparent loyalty to the kingdom. Yet even as the great army prepared to march north toward its destiny, disturbing signs began to emerge that not everyone shared Choi Young's enthusiasm for the coming conflict. Yi Seong-gye, in particular, seemed increasingly troubled by the prospect of war with the Ming Empire. His concerns, initially expressed privately to trusted subordinates, gradually became more open and more pointed. The younger general's objections to the campaign crystallized into 4 specific arguments that he presented to anyone willing to listen. First, he argued that it was fundamentally wrong for a small nation to challenge a great power, regardless of the justice of its cause. Second, he warned that mounting a major military campaign during the summer months would expose the army to disease and logistical difficulties that could prove decisive. Third, he pointed out that concentrating Goryeo's military strength in the north would leave the southern coasts vulnerable to renewed Japanese attacks. Finally, he predicted that the rainy season would make military operations extremely difficult if not impossible. These were not the concerns of a coward or a traitor, but of a thoughtful commander who understood the enormous risks involved in the proposed campaign. Yi Seong-gye's military reputation was beyond question, and his strategic insights deserved serious consideration. Yet for Choi Young, such objections missed the fundamental point at stake. Some principles were worth defending regardless of the odds or consequences. The old general's response to his subordinates' concerns was both understanding and inflexible. He acknowledged the validity of Yi Seong-gye's tactical analysis, while making clear that the strategic decision had already been made at the highest levels of government. Personal opinions about the wisdom of the campaign were irrelevant now that the king had committed the kingdom to war. In April of 1388, the Great Army finally began its march toward the Yalu River, and the confrontation that would determine Korea's future. The sight was magnificent and terrible, thousands of soldiers moving in disciplined columns along the ancient roads that led to the northern frontier, their weapons glinting in the spring sunlight, their banners streaming in the wind like rivers of silk and gold. King Yu had wanted to accompany the expedition personally, but Choi Young dissuaded him with arguments that proved prophetic. If your majesty departs, who will remain to govern the kingdom? The general understood that successful military campaigns required secure bases of support, and nothing was more important than maintaining political stability in the capital, while the army was engaged in distant operations. The march north proceeded without significant incident, but careful observers noted growing tensions between the expedition's senior commanders.
Cho Min-soo remained solidly behind Choi Young's strategic vision. But Yi Seong-gye's reservations seemed to deepen with every mile that brought them closer to the point of no return. These tensions came to a head when the army reached Wihwado Island, a strategic position in the middle of the Yalu River that would serve as the launching point for the invasion of Ming territory. The island itself was unremarkable, a small patch of land surrounded by the muddy waters of Korea's northern boundary. Yet it would become one of the most famous locations in Korean history. The place where the fate of a dynasty was decided not by foreign enemies, but by internal betrayal. The weather seemed determined to validate Yi Seong-gye's earlier warnings about the difficulties of summer campaigning. Heavy rains had swollen the Yalu beyond its normal boundaries, turning what should have been a manageable river crossing into a dangerous and potentially impossible undertaking. The island where the army had established its forward base was partially flooded, forcing soldiers to sleep in muddy conditions that bred disease and sapped morale. From the capital, messages arrived almost daily urging the commanders to proceed with the invasion regardless of weather conditions. King Yu and his advisors, having committed themselves to war, were unwilling to accept any delays that might give the Ming Empire time to prepare more effective defenses. The pressure to act, to justify the enormous expense and risk of the campaign, mounted with each passing day. It was in this atmosphere of mounting tension and deteriorating conditions that Yi Seong-gye made the decision that would change the course of Korean history. On a rain-soaked morning in May, as his subordinates waited for orders to begin the river crossing, the right-wing commander instead ordered his forces to reverse course and march back toward the capital. The moment of betrayal was swift and shocking in its audacity. Officers who had expected to cross the Yalu into enemy territory instead found themselves following their commander on a march that would lead them back to Gaegyeong. Soldiers who had prepared for battle against Chinese forces discovered that their real target was their own government. When news of Yi Seong-gye's reversal reached Choi Young on Wihwado Island, the old general's reaction was one of stunned disbelief followed by cold fury. This was not just military insubordination, but the ultimate betrayal of everything he had fought for throughout his career. The subordinate he had trusted with half the army had chosen personal calculation over national honor, political ambition over military duty. Choi Young's options were limited and all of them desperate. He could attempt to continue the campaign with the forces remaining under his direct command, but this would mean crossing the Yalu with perhaps half the strength originally planned for the operation. He could abandon the expedition and return to face whatever political consequences awaited in the capital. Or he could attempt to intercept Yi Seong-gye's forces and restore military discipline through force of arms. The choice he made reflected both his strategic realism and his ultimate loyalty to the kingdom's legitimate government. Rather than pursuing a hopeless campaign with inadequate forces or initiating a civil war on the northern frontier, Choi Young ordered the abandonment of Wihwado Island and a rapid march back to Gaegyeong. If Yi Seong-gye wanted to play politics instead of soldier, then the contest would be decided in the political arena. But the old general had underestimated both the speed of his rival's advance and the extent of the conspiracy that had been organized against the government. By the time Choi Young's loyal forces reached the outskirts of the capital, Yi Seong-gye's army was already in position to control access to the city. What should have been a return from military campaign had become a race for political survival. The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Choi Young's forces, exhausted from their forced march and demoralized by the collapse of the campaign they had been prepared to fight, could not match the organized resistance of Yi Seong-gye's well-prepared troops. The battle for the capital was over almost before it began, ending with the capture of the man who had dominated Korean politics for the better part of 2 decades. The meeting between captor and captive has been preserved in historical records that capture both the magnitude of the moment and the complex emotions it generated. Yi Seong-gye
confronting the defeated general who had been both mentor and rival, struggled to justify his actions. This turn of events was not my original intention. However, the plan to attack Liaodong violated the great principle and endangered the state while troubling the people. Their resentment reached to heaven, making this outcome inevitable. Farewell, General. Farewell. Choi Young's response, if any was recorded, has been lost to history. Perhaps there were no words adequate to express the bitter irony of a patriot destroyed by those he had sought to protect. A loyal servant betrayed by his own subordinates. A guardian of the realm undone by the very men he had trained and promoted. The aftermath of Wihwado unfolded with the inexorable logic of political revolution. King Yu, stripped of his military support and faced with overwhelming opposition, had no choice but to abdicate in favor of his young son Chang. But even this concession proved insufficient to satisfy the new power structure that was emerging under Yi Seong-gye's leadership. Choi Young's fate was sealed by the very completeness of his previous victories over political rivals. He had accumulated too much power, made too many enemies, and represented too much of the old order to be allowed any chance of staging a comeback. His exile to distant provinces was merely the prelude to charges of treason that everyone understood would be resolved by execution. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice. But it served the political purpose of legitimizing the new regime while eliminating any possibility of counter-revolution. Choi Young, the man who had saved the kingdom from foreign invasion and internal conspiracy, now found himself condemned as a traitor by judges whose own positions depended on his destruction. When the final moment came in December of 1388, the old general faced death with the same courage he had shown in life. Historical accounts describe his demeanor as calm and composed, showing no sign of fear or regret. He had lived according to his principles, served his country to the best of his ability, and accepted the consequences of his choices without complaint or self-pity. The public reaction to his execution revealed the complex legacy he would leave behind. The same people who had benefited from his military victories now witnessed his political defeat with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. The markets of the capital closed in spontaneous mourning. Citizens who had never met him personally wept openly in the streets. Even children too young to understand politics seemed to sense that something precious had been lost. The burial that followed became the foundation of legends that would outlast the dynasty itself. Choi Young's final resting place, in what is now Gaegyeong, became a site of pilgrimage for those who remembered his service to the kingdom. Most remarkably, the grave itself seemed to bear witness to his character. The earth remained barren and red, as if the soil itself refused to forget the injustice of his fate. His reed tomb became a powerful symbol of integrity uncompromised by corruption, principle unshaken by adversity, and loyalty unrewarded by earthly justice. Folktales grew around it, claiming that the strange coloration proved Choi Young's final assertion, that he had never been motivated by personal greed or ambition. In the centuries that followed, Choi Young's reputation underwent a remarkable transformation. The traitor condemned by Yi Seong-gye's regime gradually became a folk hero celebrated for his unwavering loyalty and personal integrity. Shamans claimed him as a guardian spirit. Common people prayed to him for protection and justice. His image appeared in shrines across the peninsula, transformed from political enemy to spiritual protector. His posthumous vindication reflected a deeper truth about Choi Young's significance in Korean history. While his specific political choices might be debated, his fundamental character, the absolute loyalty, the personal incorruptibility, the willingness to sacrifice everything for principle, resonated across generations and political systems. The irony of his legacy is that the very qualities that led to his political destruction also ensured his spiritual immortality. A more flexible Min might have survived the transition to the new order, but he would not have become the symbol of integrity that Choi Young represents in Korean culture.
his refusal to compromise, his willingness to face death, rather than betrayal of his principles, elevated him from historical figure to cultural icon. Today, more than 6 centuries after his death, Choi Young remains one of the most revered figures in Korean history. His story continues to inspire those who face impossible choices between survival and principle, between personal safety and public duty, between the wisdom of compromise and the demands of honor. In the end, perhaps that is the most fitting memorial for a man who gave everything in service to his country, not the monuments that crumble with time, but the example that lives forever in the hearts of those who understand that some things are worth more than life itself. As we reach the end of our journey through Choi Young's remarkable life, we see a figure who embodied both the greatest strengths and the tragic limitations of his age. He was a warrior in an era that demanded diplomats, a loyalist in a time of shifting allegiances, a man of absolute principle in a world of relative values. His story reminds us that history is shaped not just by the victorious, but by those who dare to stand for something greater than themselves, even when they know the cost will be everything they hold dear. In Choi Young's example, we find not just the record of one man's life, but a meditation on the eternal questions of duty, honor, and the price of integrity in an imperfect world. The boy who lost his father at 16 became the father figure for an entire nation. The young soldier who fought pirates on distant shores became the guardian of a kingdom's independence. The exile who endured political disgrace became the symbol of uncompromising principle. The general who fell at Wihwado Island became the spiritual protector who watches over Korea. Still, close your eyes and let these whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep.